I never planned on spending 5 days trapped in a car with my brother's best friend, but life has a way of dragging you toward the things you've been avoiding for years. My name is Colby Hartman, and until this road trip began, Jace Holloway was just a guy I silently admired from the corners of family barbecues, holiday dinners, and summer afternoons when my brother Mason dragged him home like an honorary sibling. I knew him well enough to recognize his laugh, his calm swagger, the way his voice dipped when he was being sincere. But I didn't know him, not really. And he didn't know me, not beyond Mason's shy younger brother who barely left the house. But that changed the morning he showed up in my driveway. I was still half asleep, clutching a travel mug like it was a lifeline, when Jace hopped out his truck, sunglasses pushed onto his hair, smile too bright for 6 in the morning. "You ready, Colby?" he asked, like this was something we had planned together. Like I wasn't a last-minute replacement for Mason, whose sudden work emergency left me filling his spot on the cross-state trip to Colorado. I managed and gnawed, even though my stomach churned with nerves. Being around Jace always had that effect, like gravity tightened, pulling me closer whether I wanted it or not. It wasn't that he was intimidating. He just had this presence, this natural confidence I envied but could never imitate. "Cool," he said, swinging my duffel bag into the truck bed like it weighed nothing. "Let's hit the road before traffic decides to ruin our lives." I climbed into the passenger seat and immediately regretted agreeing to this trip. The truck smelled like citrus, leather, and a hint of cologne, his cologne. The kind I'd secretly memorized over the years. The kind that made it impossible to forget who I was sitting next to. As he pulled out of the driveway, I stole a glance at him. Jace looked the same as always. Broad shoulders, suntanned skin, and that easy grin that made everyone around him feel like a friend. But there was something softer in his eyes this morning. Something I couldn't easily read. "So," he said as we merged on the highway, "Mason told me you've never done a long road trip before." Of course Mason told him. My brother loved sharing the details of my life with the people who didn't need to know them. "I haven't," I answered quietly. "Not really." "Well," Jay said, tapping the steering wheel, "I'll make sure it's a good first one." He said it casually, but something about the way he glanced at me made the words linger. For the first hour, we hardly spoke. I watched the road blur by while Jace hummed along to the playlist he'd made. Every so often, he tapped the wheel or nodded the beat. His energy felt steady, comforting even. Eventually, the silence stretched thin enough that I felt obligated to fill it. "So, why didn't you cancel the trip when Mason couldn't come?" I asked, trying to sound casual. He shrugged. "Figured you might want to get out of town. And honestly, I needed the break." It was a simple answer, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more he wasn't saying. We stopped for gas around 10, and while Jace filled up the tank, I leaned against the truck, trying to slow my thoughts. This trip was supposed to be simple. Get to Colorado, help Jace deliver a set of custom photography equipment to a friend, and then drive back. Simple, but my heart didn't understand simple when it came to him. When he came back from the store with 2 sodas, he handed one to me without asking what I liked. "You always drank this at Mason's parties," he said. "Figured it's your go-to." The fact that he remembered something that small about me sent a quiet shock through my chest. We got back on the road, and this time he talked more. Stories about his job, the people he'd met, the places he wanted to see. His openness caught me off guard. He'd always seemed like someone who kept only the most polished parts of himself visible. But as he talked, a different version appeared. One with edges, doubts, and ambitions that didn't fit the playful persona he usually carried. At some point, he asked about me, my interests, my work, what I wanted to do beyond the small routines that made up my life. I tried to answer honestly without sounding like I had nothing going for me. He didn't laugh. He didn't compare me to Mason. He just listened, nodding thoughtfully, as if every word mattered. Around noon, he turned off the main road and drove us to a lookout point he claimed was underrated and criminally ignored by the entire population. When we stepped out, the world opened into a stretch of hills, tall grass swaying on the wind, sunlight scattering across the landscape like gold dust. "Worth it?" he asked. I nodded, unable to speak for a moment. "Yeah, it is." Jace nudged my arm lightly. See? Told you I'd make your first road trip memorable. The touch was brief, but enough to send heat racing up my neck. We stood there for a few minutes, letting the silence settle comfortably for the first time. It wasn't awkward. It wasn't heavy. It just felt right, like the distance between us had shrunk without either of us noticing. Back in the truck, the energy had shifted. I felt it in the way Jace glanced over at me more frequently, like he was trying to figure me out. I felt in my own chest, where the nervousness slowly turned into something warmer. But I reminded myself to be careful. Jace wasn't mine. He'd never been mine. He was Mason's best friend, practically family, and getting attached would only end in heartbreak. Still, the way he kept stealing tiny looks at me made it hard to believe I was imagining everything. By late afternoon, my nerves began settling into curiosity. Maybe this trip wouldn't be as suffocating as I feared. Maybe Jace wasn't the unreachable figure I'd built in my mind all these years. Maybe he was something else. Someone else. Someone I didn't fully understand yet. As the sun dipped low and the highway stretched endlessly ahead, Jace lowered the music and said quietly, almost like a confession, "I'm glad you came with me, Colby." My breath caught. There was no teasing in his voice, no casual charm, just sincerity. I stared out the window, pretending not to be shaken by it, but inside, something shifted, subtle, unsteady, and impossible to ignore. And though I didn't know it yet, that tiny shift was the beginning of everything that followed. The good, the painful, and the part of the story I wasn't ready to see coming. The second morning of the trip began with the kind of quiet that felt intentional, as if the world had softened its edges just enough for two people to finally hear each other. I woke to the sound of Jace shuffling through his backpack outside the motel door, humming lightly, his voice rough from sleep. It surprised me how comforting that sound was, how natural it felt to wake up knowing he was a few steps away. That wasn't normal for us. Nothing about this trip was normal. When I stepped outside, he looked up, sunglasses dangling from his hand, hair slightly messy in a way I'd never seen before. "Morning, Colby," he said with a smile that landed too easily on me. I nodded back, tried to hide the warmth spreading across my chest. "Morning." We loaded our bags into the truck and hit the road again, the engine humming beneath us, miles stretching ahead like a promise or a warning. I couldn't tell which. The air felt lighter between us, less hesitant than yesterday. Jay seemed determined to keep the atmosphere easy, playing upbeat music, drumming on the steering wheel, occasionally glancing at me as if testing whether I was finally comfortable beside him. Eventually, he lowered the volume and leaned back slightly. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Depends how invasive it is," I said, attempting humor. He smirked. "Why don't you travel much? You seem like someone who would enjoy it." His question caught me off guard. People didn't usually care why I did or didn't do things. Not even Mason asked questions like that. I shrugged, fingers tracing the edge of my water bottle. "I don't know," I admitted. "I guess I've always stayed close to home. Routine feels safe." Jace glanced at me, eyes thoughtful. Safe doesn't always mean good. I looked out the window, embarrassed by how accurately he read me. "I know." There was a pause, long, contemplative, not uncomfortable. Jace continued. "When I was your age, I kept myself boxed in too. Didn't trust anything outside what I already understood. Eventually, I realized that kind of life suffocates you." His honesty surprised me once again. I'd always assumed he lived boldly, fearlessly, like everything came naturally. But this version of him, reflective, vulnerable, felt like something he didn't show just anyone. It made me curious, and curiosity was dangerous around him. "So what changed?" I asked. He let out a soft laugh. "Someone told me I was wasting my 20s being scared of my own choices. And they were right. I didn't ask who that someone was. I didn't want names or details to interrupt the moment. We drove in silence for a while, both lost in thoughts that didn't need explaining. The road curved through small towns, past farms and weathered barns, until we reached a place where the land opened into a wide stretch of fields dotted with yellow wildflowers. Jay slowed the truck, gaze fixed on the scenery. "Let's pull over," he said suddenly. Before I could ask why, he stopped at the edge of the field and hopped out. I followed him, the warm breeze brushing against my face as I stepped into the tall grass. The field was almost too beautiful. Sunlight shifting like liquid gold between the flowers, wind carrying the faint smell of earth and something sweet. "Thought you might like this," he said, hands in his pockets. "It's peaceful. Good spot to breathe." I didn't realize how tense I had been until that moment. Standing there, surrounded by open sky and the quiet hum of nature, something inside me loosened. "You always find places like this?" I asked. "Only when I'm looking for them," he replied, his voice softer than before. That answer lingered in the air longer than it should have. We walked through the field slowly. At one point, the grass brushed against my leg, and I stumbled slightly. Jace instinctively reached for my arm, steadying me. His fingers were warm around my wrist, and I felt the contact long after he let go. "Careful," he murmured. "Sorry," I said, though I wasn't sure what I was apologizing for. Maybe for how easily he affected me. Back in the truck, the mood had changed again. Heavier, deeper, threaded with an unspoken awareness neither of us addressed. Jace turned the music to something low and steady, the kind of song that fills space without intruding. He cleared his throat after a while. "You know, Mason talked about you a lot." I stiffened. "Great." I muttered. "No, I mean in a good way," he clarified quickly. "He worries you isolate yourself too much. Says you're smart, loyal, talented, but you keep your world small." "That's not his business," I said quietly. Jace didn't argue. He just watched the highway ahead, fingers tightening around the steering wheel. "I'm not trying to push you," he said. I don't know. I want to understand you." That stunned me. No one had ever said something like that, not even family. My heartbeat quickened, and I had to look away to keep him from noticing. "Why?" I asked softly, unable to stop myself. His answer was delayed, like he had to sift through a dozen possibilities before choosing one. "Because you don't let people understand you. But you let me, at least a little." He wasn't wrong. I had opened up more to him in 24 hours than I usually did in a year. I didn't like admitting that, but it was the truth. The rest of the afternoon passed in waves of conversation and quiet stretches. Jace kept drawing things out of me. My favorite films, what I want to do with my life, what scared me, what I wished I were brave enough to try. And every time I hesitated, he filled the silence with reassuring glances or comments that made me feel seen rather than judged. Somewhere along the winding roads, I learned a few things about him, too. That he hated eggs unless they were scrambled. That he used to take photos of strangers in parks because he liked capturing moments people didn't think anyone noticed. That he feared disappointing people more than failing himself. Each detail felt like a thread weaving him into the fabric of my thoughts. By the time the sun began dipping behind the mountains, painting the sky in soft oranges and fading pinks, I realized something I didn't want to admit. I was starting to trust him. Trust his attention. Trust the way he looked at me. Trust the idea that maybe this trip wasn't just a coincidence thrown together by circumstances. But trust is dangerous, especially with someone who could crush it without meaning to. As we drove into the early evening, Jace reached over and lowered the visor on my side because the sunlight was in my eyes. The gesture was small, simple, gentle, but it felt too deliberate, too caring, too personal. "Better?" he asked. I nodded, unable to form a full sentence. My voice had gotten lost somewhere between fear and something dangerously close to hope. And just like that, the road stretched forward again, quiet, golden, and impossibly uncertain. By the third day, something unspoken had rooted itself between us. Soft, persistent, and impossible to ignore. It lived in the glances Jace shot my way when he thought I wasn't looking, in the moments his hand lingered a fraction too long, when he passed me something, in the pauses between conversations, when neither of us dared break whatever fragile thread held us together. I kept telling myself it was nothing, that I was projecting, that this was just how Jace treated people when he actually slowed down long enough to care. But even lies start to crumble if you press them too hard. We left a small mountain town early that morning, the air crisp enough that our breaths clouded faintly as we loaded the truck. Jace handed me a warm breakfast sandwich, acting like it was nothing, but his tone gave him away. "Didn't know what you liked, so I guessed," he said, scratching the back of his neck. Hope it's okay? It is, I said, even though the food barely mattered. It was the gesture that hit me. The effort, the pause before he spoke, the quiet expectation in his eyes, as if he needed my approval for something far deeper than breakfast. We drove through winding roads lined with tall pines, their shadows stretching across the pavement like long fingers. For a while, the only sounds were the hum of the engine and the rhythmic thud of tires against the asphalt. Then Jace broke the quiet. Can I ask you something a little personal? I tensed slightly. You can try. He huffed a laugh, eyes flicking toward me. Why do you always act surprised when someone cares about you? The question was a small explosion in my chest. Quiet but shattering. I wasn't sure how to answer, without unraveling too much. I'm not used to it, I said carefully. People don't usually go out of their way for me. That's because people are idiots, he said bluntly. You're worth the effort, Colby. His tone was steady, not exaggerated or performative. It was the kind of sentence someone didn't say unless they meant it, and that made it dangerous. I swallowed hard, looking out the window. You barely know me. Maybe, he said, then paused. But I want to. My fingers tightened around the edge of my seat. He didn't realize what his words did to me. Or maybe he did and said them anyway. Later in the morning, Jace pulled off the highway and onto a narrow dirt road that wound up a small incline. I frowned. Where are we going now? There's a viewpoint up here, he said. I came here once with Mason, but we didn't stay long. It felt like a place you'd like. A place I'd like. Not Mason. Not anyone else. Me. When we reached the top, the world stretched out in layers. Rolling hills, a shimmering lake in the distance, and a sky so wide it made everything else feel small. The wind swept over the ridge, cool and clean. I stepped out of the truck and walked to the edge, letting the view fill the quiet parts of me. Jay stood beside me, hands shoved into his jacket pockets. Worth the detour? Yeah, I said softly. It is. Good, he murmured. I wanted to show you something beautiful. His voice dipped at the end, barely audible over the wind, but I caught it anyway. We lingered there longer than we needed to. Sometimes we talked, sometimes we didn't, but the silence didn't feel empty. It felt like a language all its own, one we were slowly learning together. When we finally got back on the road, Jace rolled down his window a few inches, letting the cold air sweep through the cabin. He looked more relaxed than I'd seen him all trip, more open. So, he said, fingers tapping the steering wheel lightly. Mason told me you write. Heat rose to my face. I don't write. Not really. I just put thoughts down sometimes. That still counts. It's nothing special, I muttered. It is to me, he said. I stared at him, tried to figure out what angle he was working, but his eyes stayed forward, focused on the road, not even flinching at his own words. Like he hadn't said something that made my pulse stumble. He continued, I think people who write are the ones who see the world differently. They notice details, moments, things other people miss. He paused, glancing sideways at me. You notice things, Colby, more than you think. His insight hit too close, too accurately. It was overwhelming. The attention, the care, the vulnerability. He wasn't hiding anymore. By midday, we stopped at a small roadside cafe. The place had mismatched chairs, handwritten menus, and the smell of fresh baked bread that made the entire atmosphere warm. Jace insisted on paying despite my attempt to argue. Let me do this, he said, brushing past my protest with a soft smile. I want to. We sat across from each other, sunlight pooling between us. At one point, Jace leaned forward, forearms on the table, eyes locked with mine. You keep surprising me, he said. How? You're quieter than most people I know, but somehow you feel louder than any of them. His words settled between us like a spark, waiting for something to ignite it. I looked down, unsure what to do with the heat crawling up my neck. I don't think I'm loud. No, he said gently, but you feel real. The way he said it made it impossible to breathe for a moment. After lunch, we continued driving, but the mood had shifted into something denser, charged. The truck felt smaller, the distance between our seats narrower. Every brush of movement, his arm adjusting the air vent, my hand shifting slightly, felt amplified. Jace reached for the radio, but instead of turning up the music, he turned it off completely. The cabin fell into silence. Not awkward, not forced, just focused. "You know," he said quietly, "there's something I haven't told you." My pulse quickened. "What is it?" He exhaled slowly, like he was deciding whether to open a door he wasn't sure he should. "Before this trip, I wasn't sure how things would go. I didn't know if we'd get along or if it would be weird without Mason. And now," I asked, barely above a whisper. "Now," he said, eyes lingering on me longer than necessary, "I'm glad it's you." The words settled in my chest like a weight I wasn't sure I could carry. I didn't respond. Not because I didn't want to, but because the truth bubbling up inside me felt too dangerous to say aloud. The possibility growing between us was fragile, trembling like something that couldn't survive too much attention. We drove the rest of the afternoon with that weight between us, not speaking about it, but both aware of its presence. Every mile deep in the tension, not the painful kind, but the kind that warns you something is shifting, changing, moving toward a place you can't predict. When the sky began turning amber, Jace finally spoke again. "Tomorrow," he said, "we'll hit the last stretch to Colorado." I nodded. "Yeah. You okay with that?" "I am." His fingers drummed lightly against the console, like he was fighting the urge to say more. Instead, he offered a small, almost uncertain smile. "Good," he said softly. I like having you here." That should have reassured me. Instead, it scared me, because feelings like that don't stay soft. They grow sharp edges, and sharp edges always find a place to cut. I didn't expect the silence between us to feel this heavy. It stretched across the room like something alive, something watching us both in the shadows we didn't dare acknowledge. Rowan stood near the window, his back turned to me, shoulders tight as if bracing for an invisible impact. The sunlight caught in his hair, softening the edges of a posture that otherwise looked carved from stone. I could tell he was replaying everything we had said to each other, every truth, every lie, every half-confession we didn't mean to let slip. He finally spoke without turning around. "You didn't have to come after me." His voice was steady, but I heard the exhaustion underneath it, the kind that came not from running, but from feeling too much for too long. "I couldn't just let you walk out," I said. "Not like that." He turned then, slowly, as if afraid the room might change while he looked away. His gaze met mine, sharp and searching. "Why? Because you hate loose ends? Because you don't like not being in control?" The words hit harder than I wanted to admit. Rowan knew me too well now. He knew how I hid behind logic when emotions got too loud, how I used order as armor when uncertainty pressed against my ribs. "No," I said quietly, "because I don't want to lose you." Something in his expression faltered. His jaw softened, his shoulders loosened, but the hurt didn't leave his eyes. He stepped closer, not enough to touch, but enough that I felt his presence like heat against cold skin. "Then why does it feel like I'm the only one who keeps risking something here?" he asked. "Why do I feel like you're always half in, half out, waiting for someone else to make the first move so you don't have to?" I opened my mouth but didn't know what to say. He was right. I had been careful from the moment I met him, cautious in ways that protected me but wounded him. I told myself it wasn't my fault, that I needed time, that I needed certainty. But deep down I knew it was cowardice dressed as reason. Rowan sighed, dragging a hand through his hair. "I'm tired, okay? Of feeling like I'm reaching across a bridge that keeps moving away from me." His honesty made something inside me crack. He had always been brave, even when he pretended otherwise. Brave enough to risk being hurt. Brave enough to want something real. "I know I haven't been fair," I said. "I know I made you feel like an option when you never were. I didn't know how to let myself want something without being afraid of losing it." Rowan's eyes flickered. Hurt, understanding, frustration, longing. A complicated mixture that mirrored everything twisting inside me. "Then tell me something real," he said. He wasn't begging. He wasn't demanding. He was asking because he deserved it. "Tell me why you keep holding back." I swallowed hard. My chest felt tight, as if a storm had gathered beneath my ribs. Because the last time I let myself care this much, everything fell apart, I said, and I'm scared the same thing will happen again. Rowan stepped closer. This time he didn't stop. He stood right in front of me, close enough that I could feel the warmth of his breath, the tension in his body, the quiet tremor of someone who wanted to believe but didn't know how. I'm not them, he whispered, and I'm not asking you to fall apart. I'm asking you to show up. The simplicity of the request struck deeper than any accusation could have. I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the truth I'd been avoiding. He cared. He cared enough to stay even when walking away would be easier. He cared enough to fight for something I kept pushing to the edges. I exhaled. I'm trying, I said, my voice low, maybe slower than you want, maybe clumsier than I should be, but I'm trying. For the first time since the argument, he softened fully. The tension in his posture melted, his shoulders dropping, his breathing easing. But there was still a question lingering between us, unspoken yet heavy. Trying is the same as choosing, he said. I nodded. Then let me choose. His eyes widened slightly, hope flickering there like a lit match in the dark. And what are you choosing? You, I said. The word came out steady, almost startlingly sure. I'm choosing you. Rowan's jaw trembled for a moment. He looked away, blinking hard, as if trying to hide the way that single sentence shook him. I want to believe you, he said quietly. Then believe me. I stepped closer, closing the last inches between us. Or let me prove it. He looked up again, and something shifted, something slow, cautious, but real. He exhaled a sound that was half relief, half fear. Okay, he whispered, but I need to know you're not saying this just because you're afraid I'll leave. I'm saying it because I'm afraid of losing the only thing that's felt real in a long time. Silence settled again, but this time it wasn't cold. It wasn't hostile. It was a silence that held a fragile promise, like the space right before confession becomes a beginning. Rowan reached out first. His fingers brushed mine, hesitant but intentional. I intertwined my hand with his, and he didn't pull away. The connection was small, almost nothing, yet it felt like something monumental, something we had been circling for too long without daring to touch. I don't want perfect, Rowan murmured. I just want honest. I can give you that, I said. He nodded, and for a brief moment, the room felt lighter. The air no longer pressed down on us. The distance that had stretched between us now felt crossable, manageable, something we could bridge together if we stayed steady. But just as peace began to settle, Rowan's expression shifted again, subtle, uncertain, as if another thought tugged at him from the inside. What is it? I asked. He hesitated. There's something you need to know. Something I didn't tell you before. My heartbeat faltered. The fragile calm in the room shook, a quiet tension threading itself back into the atmosphere. Tell me, I said. Rowan drew a slow breath, eyes flicking to the window, and then back to me. It's about the message you saw, the one you asked me about. A chill ran through me, thin but unmistakable. The quiet promise between us trembled. What about it? His throat tightened. I wasn't completely honest. The moment hung suspended, sharp as glass, begging for the truth waiting behind it. And with that single sentence, everything shifted again, opening a door neither of us were ready to face, but both knew we couldn't avoid. Rowan didn't speak at first. He stood in front of me as if the truth he carried was too heavy to hold, too fragile to drop, too dangerous to hand over carelessly. His fingers tightened at his sides, knuckles whitening as he forced himself to continue. I wasn't lying when I said the message wasn't what you thought, he began, voice low, almost fragile. But I wasn't telling you everything either. My breath hitched, not from anger but from the sharp sting of déjà vu, of half-truths dressed as protection, of secrets disguised as caution. I hated that it made me feel small again, like a version of myself I thought I'd left behind. Then tell me now, I said. All of it. He nodded slowly, as if he had been expecting those exact words. He looked down, gathering the courage that seemed to catch in his throat, then finally forced it free. The person who sent the message wasn't just someone I used to know. His eyes lifted, meeting mine with a weight that made my chest tighten. He was someone I used to love. A quiet thud echoed inside me. Recognition, jealousy, fear, something uncomfortably close to betrayal. But Rowan kept going before any of it could spill out. He reached out because he found out I was seeing someone, he said. He wanted to talk. He wanted to meet. And I ignored him. I blocked him after you asked me about it. I didn't want him interfering with us. Interfering how? I asked, though part of me already knew. Former lovers rarely return without purpose. Rowan inhaled sharply. He wanted another chance. The room felt smaller, as if the walls were leaning in, listening, judging, tightening the air around us. Did you? I asked, hating how vulnerable questions sounded. He stepped closer, shaking his head with a swiftness that almost broke me. No, not for a second. Not in any way that mattered. His voice cracked, raw, earnest, desperate to be believed. If I wanted him, I wouldn't be here. I wouldn't be fighting for us. Some of the pressure eased, but didn't disappear. Something deeper, older, slithered out of me, a fear I had buried beneath careful control and quiet caution. Why didn't you just tell me? I asked, why hide it when you knew it would come out eventually? Because, he whispered, I didn't want you to think you were competing with someone you already won against. For a moment, I said nothing. Rowan stood there as if bracing for impact, as if prepared for me to shut him out, turn away, or break apart in front of him. But all I felt was a strange, aching mix of hurt and relief. Hurt that he hid it, relief that he chose me despite it. You should have trusted me with the truth, I said quietly. I know. He swallowed hard. And I'm sorry. Truly. He reached for my hand, hesitated, then pulled back as if afraid he no longer had the right. That hesitation hurt more than the revelation itself. I stepped closer, closing the space he was too unsure to cross. Look at me, I said. His eyes lifted, vulnerable in a way that made my chest warm and ache all at once. I'm not angry that someone from your past resurfaced, I said. I'm hurt because you faced it alone when you didn't have to. I wanted to be part of your fears, not just your good moments. A breath escaped him, unsteady, almost disbelieving. I didn't want to lose you over something that didn't even tempt me. You didn't lose me, I said. Then what happens now? He asked. The question hovered between us like a fragile thread, trembling but unbroken. I reached out, this time taking his hand, instead of waiting for him. His fingers curled around mine instantly, instinctively, like he had been waiting for that touch all along. Now we stopped running from the truth. I said, yours, mine. Rowan's eyes glistened with a softness that made everything inside me loosen. Are you sure? For the first time, I said, yes. Something in him melted. Relief mixed with disbelief, the kind of release that only comes after holding tension for far too long. He stepped closer until his forehead rested gently against mine, our breaths mingling, the air turning warm between us. I don't want to lose this, Rowan murmured. I don't want to lose you. You won't, I whispered back. Not unless you walk away. I'm done walking away. His voice wasn't shaky anymore. It carried conviction, quiet but unmistakable. We stood like that, the soften of the room fading, the world narrowing to something simple and real. His thumb brushed against my hand, small, tentative, meaningful. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it held more truth than anything he could have said. But just as the moment steadied, something changed in Rowan's expression. A shadow crossed his features, brief, sharp, unmistakable. I leaned back slightly, searching his eyes. What? I asked. He hesitated. I recognize that hesitation now, the same one that came right before he revealed something important, something heavy. There's more, he said softly. About him. My pulse quickened, not from anger but from the instinctive need to brace. Tell me. Rowan took a breath that shook faintly. Before I blocked his number, he sent me one last message. I felt the shift, small, quiet, but electric, and I pressed, my heartbeat thick in my ears. Rowan's gaze lowered, his lashes trembling. He said he wasn't done, that he was coming here, that he needed to talk to me face to face. The words hit like a ripple turning into a wave. slow at first, then swelling into something undeniable. I felt the air around us sharpen. "He's coming here?" I repeated. Rowan nodded, guilt tightening every line of his posture. He said he'd arrive sometime this week. The fragile calm we had fought for trembled on the edge of something new, something uncertain, something we weren't prepared for but could no longer avoid. "Why didn't you tell me earlier?" I asked, though the answer was already etched across his face. "Because I was afraid it would ruin everything," he whispered. I exhaled slowly, letting the truth settle, letting the complication expand into the space between us. Rowan watched me, fear flickering at the edges of his hope. "Does this change anything?" he asked, voice barely louder than a breath. I didn't look away. "It changes everything," I said. Then I held his hand tighter. "But it doesn't change us." The relief that washed over him was subtle but real, like sunlight breaking through a gray morning, not bright enough to blind, but enough to see clearly again. Still, beneath that relief, another truth lingered. A confrontation was coming, and neither of us knew what it would unearth. Rowan barely slept that night, and truthfully, neither did I. Every time I closed my eyes, my mind replayed the same question in a loop that scraped against my nerves. What does someone want badly enough to show up uninvited after being told to walk away? The uncertainty pressed down on me like a weight I couldn't shift. Morning came quietly, with a muted light slipping to the blinds, but it didn't bring clarity. Rowan stood by the window, already dressed, his shoulders stiff, his jaw working back and forth, as if he was chewing on thoughts too sharp to swallow. He looked like someone waiting for a storm that carried both dread and inevitability. "He'll probably come today," Rowan said without turning around. "Do you want him to?" I asked, not accusing, just honest. He shook his head instantly. "No, but he will anyway." I stepped closer, the floorboard soft beneath my feet, the silence between us threaded with care and tension. Rowan finally turned, and the look in his eyes said everything he didn't know how to translate into words. Fear, regret, determination, the fragile hope that we were strong enough to withstand whatever this day would bring. "Then we face it together," I said. That was the first moment his shoulders loosened since the night before, as if the burden he carried had shifted enough to make breathing easier. The day unfolded slowly, each hour thick with anticipation. We didn't go anywhere we couldn't. The possibility of a knock on the door lingered like a shadow that stretched across everything we tried to do. Rowan attempted reading. I tried writing. Neither of us got far. Every small sound made him flinch, and every flinch made me more aware of how deeply the situation had taken root inside him. By early afternoon, tension curled to the room like invisible smoke. Rowan paced in uneven lines across the living room, running a hand through his hair every few minutes. I watched him, trying to understand more than he explained, trying to see the pieces he didn't yet offer. "What were you like with him?" I finally asked, not out of jealousy, but curiosity about the version of Rowan that still lived in the memories of someone bold enough to come find him. Rowan's pacing slowed. He sat beside me, close but not quite touching, his knee bouncing with restless energy. "Not like this," he said. "Not like us." With him, everything felt conditional, like I had to earn every piece of affection. I convinced myself it was love, because he knew how to make the quiet feel like my fault. A quiet anger rose inside me, not at Rowan, but at the ghost we were waiting to face. "You're not that person anymore," I said. "I hope not." "You're not," I repeated, because I needed him to hear it without hesitation. A faint knock cut through the room. Rowan froze. The air became painfully still, the kind of stillness that comes before choice is made. He looked at me, eyes wide, as if asking silently whether he had enough strength to open the door. I nodded once, steady and sure, because he wasn't doing this alone. He stood. I followed. He reached for the handle, paused, took a long breath that trembled halfway through, and finally pulled the door open. A man stood on the other side, tall, carefully put together, confident in that deliberate way people use when they want to intimidate without appearing obvious. His name, I already knew, was Mason. Rowan had spoken it once, years ago in a story he didn't know I remembered until this moment. Mason's eyes flicked to me first, curiosity sharpening his expression. then returned to Rowan with a familiarity that made my stomach knot. "Rowan," he said, the syllables stretched with entitlement. "Mason," Rowan replied, the tone flat, distant, nothing like the warmth he gave me. Mason stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, the kind of move that said he still believed he had access to Rowan's life. Rowan stiffened. But he didn't move away from me, and that small choice mattered more than anything Mason could say. "I didn't come to cause problems," Mason said, which was usually what people said right before causing problems. "I just wanted to talk." "Talk about what?" Rowan asked. "You know what," Mason replied. "Us." "There is no us," Rowan said firmly. Mason's jaw twitched. "There was, and I'm not convinced you're done with it." Rowan didn't react, but something inside me did, a flicker of anger, not irrational, not possessive, but protective. Not because I feared losing Rowan, but because I hated watching someone try to claim him like a misplaced possession. "You don't make that decision," I said quietly, stepping closer. Mason's eyes slid to me, assessing, almost amused. "And you are?" "Someone who's here now," I said. Something in Rowan eased at that, a subtle shift, a reassurance he didn't have to voice. Mason exhaled sharply through his nose. "I didn't drive all this way to be dismissed. Rowan, you owe me—" "No," Rowan cut in. "I don't owe you anything." The clarity of his voice settled in my chest like warmth spreading into cold spaces. Mason blinked, thrown off by Rowan's resolve, a resolve he clearly hadn't expected. "I was going through hell when we ended," Mason argued. "I wasn't myself. You walked away at the worst possible time. You gave me no choice," Rowan said. "You kept taking and taking until I didn't recognize myself anymore. I'm not going back to that." Mason stared at him, confusion curdling into frustration. "So that's it? You replaced me?" "I've grown," Rowan replied. "That's not the same thing." The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It stretched thin and tense, a wire waiting to snap. Mason looked at me again, and this time there was something different in his eyes. Not amusement, not curiosity, but the realization that whatever hold he once had was gone. He straightened, collected his composure, and nodded once. "If that's what you want," he said. "It is," Rowan answered without hesitation. Mason didn't apologize. He didn't argue further. He simply turned and walked out the door, the sound of his fading footsteps tightening before finally breaking into quiet. Rowan closed the door slowly. His back leaned against it, his breath leaving him in a tremor that felt like the last remnants of a long-held fear finally slipping free. "You okay?" I asked. He nodded, then shook his head, then laughed, a soft, shaky laugh that belonged to someone finally unburdened. "That was harder than I thought," he admitted. "But you did it," I said. "You chose yourself, and you chose us." He stepped toward me, not rushed, not uncertain, but with a calm he hadn't carried in days. When he reached me, he stopped close enough that I felt the warmth of his breath on my skin. "I'm not looking back anymore," he said. "I want what's in front of me." "And what's that?" I asked, even though I felt the answer in the air between us. "You," he whispered. The words didn't feel like a confession. They felt like a beginning, steady, real, unforced. A choice, not a reaction. A promise, not a plea. For the first time since this began, the story didn't feel like it was tightening around us. It felt like it was opening.